you've identified a lot of stuff that I've struggled with for years. I mean, and it's just a problem with patristic exegesis generally. This whole letter spirit gamut and so on. Maximus has a great phrase that I've quoted many times where he talks about the literal meaning that is, what is it? The literal meaning in the spirit that is constantly abounding into its fullness, which is a pretty loaded phrase. But I think what he means by that is that, yeah, there is a concrete reality of sacred history that is, in some respects, on its own terms, non-negotiable. It's what has happened. It's what God has wrought. And then, however, there are also the other layers. The fact that you have human written testimony and interpretation. I mean, I really think the patristic writers themselves understood the biblical writers to be the first interpreters. They are themselves interpreting events, and so there's that sense that there is a concrete historical reality, the res, as we might call it in Latin. And of course, for Maximus, it's all, you're right, it's grounded in the ultimate historical reality of Jesus Christ and who he is as the Logos incarnate and so on. The tricky thing is when you're actually working through his biblical interpretation is the fact of the matter is the letter spirit thing is used different ways. I mean, the letter, sometimes, the literal sense, is sometimes being used as Origen often uses it, as superficial.
Yes.
This is where you end up and you stay if you're not digging, and it can be useful sometimes. There's a couple of times in the Questions to Philosophy where he'll say, and for somebody who needs a little, the literal sense here, here's the meaning and here's what might be useful from it. But that's rare. Because I think really what he's after is a richer sense of what the letter means. This is something that's been very interesting to me in recent years, that we think the spiritual meaning is complex. Well, the literal meaning is complex. Because ultimately, we already see this in Athanasius, the Cappadocians, and others, this sort of sense of a theologically literal sense of Scripture. What Athanasius called the skopos, the ultimate objective. What are these texts pointed toward? What is their meaning for the church? What is God's intended meaning for these texts, ultimately? Which means there's a sort of teleology built into the process of interpretation. And in that sense, then, the literal becomes more of an ongoing project to understand how the whole of biblical, the whole of the biblical history, the whole sacred revelation is comprehended, in the Logos as one grand scheme, one grand plot, thematic plot, and so on. And that, I think that's that's kind of going on in Origen as well already, as Bach certainly pointed out. But I'm glad you brought up the Gethsemane text, because there, Maximus realizes the literal sense is so, for him, so blatantly diatholite. That you read this text, if you read this text with the saints, with his predecessors, with the authorities, there's no way that you can step away from this without the belief that Christ had two wills, divine and human. And he's handing over his human will to the divine, and you said there's no symbolism in that. But again, those are rare instances. For the most part, we're having to dig. We're having to play the game. We're having to be teased by the literal sense. We're having to do the digging. It's a pedagogical process, interpretation. That's why it is true Maximus holds himself to it, that I'm not going to go here with this interpretation and stay here. Here's a possibility, here's a possibility, here's a possibility, here's a possibility. possibility. And another thing that's interesting is they're not necessarily vertical. It's not like, here's the least mature, here's the most mature. Here, here's an array of possibilities. They're all legitimate. They all bespeak sort of the polymorphous nature of the word. So, yeah. So, I think the best way to see it too is that at the end of the day, the letter spirit distinction can, I mean, it's there, but it kind of collapses in the actual process of interpreting texts. And so yeah, it's very complex. That's why it's really hard to describe always exactly what Maximus is doing in a text relative to that, sort of what we see as a trajectory, or a gamut from letter to spirit.